war in the Middle East and its impacts on supply chains. Most warehouses lack needed agility. And is trucking ready for a recovery? Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories, as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. I am Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by Storage Solutions. As the official North American arm of Jungheinrich, Storage Solutions brings more than 70 years of material handling and automation experience to operations across the U.S. and Canada. As you are planning for 2026, they can help you explore smarter automation, improve productivity, and build a strategy for long-term success. Learn more at storage-solutions.com. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, on the episode of our podcast that was recorded last Friday, we speculated about how war in the Middle East might affect transportation, ships moving oil and gas, and just supply chains in general within that part of the world. We did not have to wait long, as the war against Iran began less than 24 hours later. So now that we're nearly a week into the war, what have we learned about the effects on our supply chains? To explore more, here's Ben Ames with this week's guest. Ben?
Thanks, Dave. You're absolutely right. Global trade flows have been shifting significantly over the past week since the U.S. began its military assault in Iran. The action has sent ripples throughout the Middle East, even further, including shipping disruptions, energy volatility, air cargo constraints. This week, we're looking for context on what this means for shippers, retailers, importers, consumers. To help us understand those, we have our guest this week, who's Jackson Wood, Director of Industry Strategy in Global Trade Intelligence at Descartes. Welcome, Jackson.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's great to be with you.
So just to start us off, Jackson, could you give us a quick description of what Descartes does and its place in this complicated discussion?
Sure. So Descartes is a global trade, logistics, and supply chain network organization. And so what that means in practice is that we build the digital and data architecture supporting global supply chains. And so if you think about how companies, and this in all different types of companies, whether those are shippers or whether they are logistics service providers, other third parties to global trade transactions, all of those different collaborators utilize our global logistics network to share data, obtain visibility, and drive compliant global transactions. And so we work with about 30,000 global companies, and we help them with a multitude of different supply chain and logistics use cases, from fleet management, transportation management, warehouse optimization, global trade compliance, really anything that has to do with moving goods from A to B to C to D. As I said, customers of all types in all geographies around the world.
Got it. So I know that Descartes tracks global trade flows, as you've described, in that wide range of expertise there. The company produces reports on that. I know that you don't have real-time reports that might affect the impacts that we're seeing this week in Iran. But what sort of variables might we see change?
Well, I think, Ben, it's important to ground, as attention grabbing as recent events are. I think it's important to ground it in some perhaps more medium term context. And so if we go back to this time in 2020, the world was about to enter into an incredible period of uncertainty and volatility as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And at least from my perspective, having been in and around this type of business for over 25 years, so the majority of my career, I often point to that as the real inflection point where global trade and logistics and supply chains, there's pre-COVID and there is post-COVID. And if you think about really the cascade of shocks that the global economy has withstood since the pandemic started, 6 years ago. And it's not saying that there aren't unique characteristics to the conflict that has began in Iran, but we can go back through and look at, about a year ago, the shocks of the Liberation Day tariffs. Prior to that, we had, expanding conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Prior to that, we had, the snarling and the disentangling of supply chains as global economies rebounded from the initial disruption caused by the onset of the pandemic. So I provide that context simply as a way to ground how we try to interpret these most current events. And I would say at a high level, Ben, everything that we have gotten used to, whether those are fluctuating freight rates, fluctuating capacity, staffing challenges, weave into this now the role of AI and the impact that it's having on multiple different dimensions of logistics and supply chain operations. I think the biggest takeaway for companies to be thinking about, at least in the short term, vis-a-vis the Iran situation is, look, we've been dealing with this for the better part of 6 years now. Again, not acutely a unique military conflict in a highly volatile part of the world, but in terms of its first, second, third order effects, as I mentioned, I think it's going to be variations on the theme of what we have seen over the past 6 years. In terms of what the impacts those degrees of volatility are going to have, I think it's going to vary depending on the type of business that listeners might be involved in. So if you think about organizations that are moving crude oil out of the Middle East and need to navigate through the Strait of Hormuz, obviously there are very acute and very difficult challenges there because of the geopolitical situation. But if we think about zooming out in sort of concentric circles around, okay, well, what about just general ocean shipping, whether those are going to be rates, whether it's going to be capacity, there certainly will be second and third order effects. But whether you're a retailer trying to get, your summer articles into the warehouse in time for being ready in the store, or whether you're moving other types of energy products to different jurisdictions, it's going to be, as I said, very similar challenges that we've seen since COVID. It's going to be availability. It's going to be, short-term fluctuations in cost. It's going to be scrambling for warehouse space, et cetera. And you can overlay the recent volatility with respect to United States tariffs as well, because just 2 weeks ago, the United States Supreme Court struck down the legality of a very significant part of the administration's tariff program. Those tariffs were quickly replaced with new tariffs. And so there's just a lot that the global supply chains are dealing with, but have been dealing with for many years now.
Yeah, it's a great point. So, I mean, when hostilities first began, when the U.S. first began dropping the munitions in Iran, the flow of containers and ships and airplanes, things kind of freeze. But it seems that they are moving again, although maybe the routes change, and so that's going to affect the timing or the pricing or the delays. Is that right?
It's these, bottlenecks begin to emerge as, again, very similar to what we saw with COVID, where certain countries had more aggressive lockdown approaches than others. So there were places where factories were closed or ports were closed, but there were places where factories were open and ports were open. And so what I would say from my perspective, at least, and having the benefit of seeing the very rich data that flows through the global logistics network here at Descartes, is while individual component parts of the global supply chain can be a little bit brittle. So if you talk about individual ports, or you talk about individual modes of transportation, or you talk about individual sectors of the economy, there can be some fragility there. But I think when you look at the global supply chain picture, at the 30,000 foot perspective, it's incredibly resilient. And so it's not to diminish the hyper local challenges that certain types of business or certain types of operators in the global supply chain are going to have to navigate. But I continue to be impressed at the resiliency of the global trading environment as companies and countries and individual actors within the economic context demonstrate incredible creativity and incredible resilience in terms of adapting to the shocks that continue to present themselves.
Interesting. It's a good point to remember that things will keep on moving to some extent. But when these type of events happen, although the goods may continue to flow because of that resiliency, are you seeing price changes? There must be rate pressure in shipping, maritime, air, what have you. Is that right?
And that's obvious, not even just from our perspective as Descartes, but if you look at the public comments from some of the large shipping operators, they have been quite clear to say, look, we are going to be dealing with volatility in our pricing regime simply because of the degree of uncertainty that we're seeing from a geopolitical or a military perspective. And so I do think that the listeners to this podcast who are highly dependent on ocean rates and availability are really going to have to stay close to either their NVOCCs or the carriers themselves directly to get a good handle on what this cost volatility is going to look like. Because I do think that, unit cost is the one thing that a lot of people are fixated on, but I do think that there are going to be issues with capacity as well, simply because of this multi-year period of uncertainty. And again, whether that's from energy prices, whether that's from issues around access to certain lanes, et cetera, it's a very challenging time to be running an ocean carrier line. And so I have a lot of empathy for both the providers of the service, but also the purchasers of the service, because figuring out the exact right way to price and to pay for access to these this infrastructure, it feels like the ground is shifting almost constantly under our feet, which makes it very difficult to plan and to think even medium term about what the potential impacts of this volatility on our respective businesses might be.
Yeah, no doubt. But we have only about a minute left here, but I wanted to ask you, as we leave here, what can importers do about any of this? Are there any mitigation strategies you see that can be used successfully?
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to the lessons that we all collectively learned coming out of the first wave of COVID was we really need to build resiliency into our respective supply chains. And the best way to do that is as much diversification as you can manage, right? So I think there was a lot of companies that were heavily indexed to China prior to the pandemic and since the pandemic, and considering a number of different dimensions of conflict in not only the Chinese-United States relationship, but the Chinese relationship with other countries in the world, that being heavily indexed into one country and in, even more acute context, one company as core suppliers or core customers, that's really a high risk undertaking. And perhaps in a more stable global economic backdrop, that was less of a risk, but certainly we are now in, I would say, an era of persistent volatility, and that volatility is now structural. It's not episodic. Really, the only strategy that you can embrace with any confidence is to have as much resiliency as you can in your supply chain architecture. And the best way to do that is to be as diversified as possible. And again, it's not just diversification in terms of customers and vendors. It's also what other mechanisms are we taking advantage of, whether those are bonded warehouse, foreign trade zones. Are we thinking creatively about how we build our products, about the way that we classify them from a tariff or a control perspective? So it's having that resiliency is going to be and continues to be absolutely essential to navigating this volatility.
Hard-earned wisdom there. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast and share it with us. Thank you for being with us today.
You're very welcome, Ben. Thank you for the opportunity.
Our guest this week has been Jackson Wood from Descartes. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Jackson and Ben. Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. And as we just heard, having agility within our supply chains is a crucial way to prepare for unexpected events, whether that's a pandemic or now the war that we're in today. But Victoria, you wrote this week about some new research that shows agility is something that many warehouses still struggle to achieve.
Yeah, Dave, that's right. So many warehouses actually lack the technological agility to respond to disruptions, and they're paying a pretty high price for it. This is according to recent research from warehouse and distribution center technology company Lucas Systems. The company surveyed 114 U.S.-based supply chain executives about the nature of their automation adaptability. So we're talking about the automation systems in their warehouses. More than half said their automation systems are unprepared to deal with things like unforeseen changes, new requirements, and disruptions that really are plaguing today's supply chains, as we just discussed. On top of that, the study found that warehouses haven't done what it takes to be adaptable. 77% of respondents said that at least half of their hardware or software systems are too rigid to respond to unplanned disruptions, as just one example. Now, the study compares traditional warehouse automation with advanced sort of self-optimizing solutions that autonomously adjust and improve operations. To break that down a bit more, we're talking about advanced systems that include sort of software-based automation solutions, things like AMRs with an orchestration layer of software. Traditional automation, the more rigid systems, include things like fixed automation, such as automated storage and retrieval systems, conveyors, and the like.
Now, Victoria, you said the warehouses are paying a price for this lack of agility. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's right. So the report found that about 60% of those who reported rigidity in their systems said that they've incurred between 11% and 25% additional operating costs or losses from lack of automation adaptability. And those disruptions include things like system downtime, equipment failure, labor shortages, and unexpected demand spikes. And these are things that can paralyze a warehouse, in the words of Lucas Systems leaders. The report also found that the rate of disruption is increasing. 85% of respondents said that they experienced up to 10 significant unplanned disruptions in just the past year, and another 7% said they experienced more than 10. Now, those numbers stand in contrast to what the industry experienced in the wake of COVID-19. 51% of the study's respondents reported more unplanned operational disruptions than they saw 3 years ago in the aftermath of the pandemic. So things just seem to be getting more chaotic out there. And it seems like warehouse and supply chain leaders are all in on the need for adaptable automation. Just a couple of other statistics from the research. 86% of supply chain executives surveyed said that adaptable warehouse technology is critical to their business. And more than a quarter of them said that adaptable automation has helped reduce their operational costs by more than 25%.
Yeah, that seems to make a lot of sense. The adaptable systems you described should add flexibility and efficiency to many operations.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Victoria.
You're welcome.
And Ben, you reported this week that there's some signs that things may be getting a bit better for one important sector of the transportation industry.
Exactly so. We're talking about the trucking sector here. We've been covering for a long time on the podcast and in the magazine a freight recession that's really been afflicting trucking in terms of depressed rates for a long time. Of course, it's a highly cyclical business in the first place. There are changes in demand for freight, the supply, the number of trucks on the road, amount of inventory in warehouses and turnover, seasonal surges. But those changes typically sort of flip around every year or 18 months, maybe. But the North American trucking sector has been seeing depressed freight rates now for more than 3 years. So it was newsworthy this week when we saw a report from FTR, the transportation analysis firm, saying that February was a really hot month for the number of orders for Class 8 trucks and tractors. Fleets wouldn't buy this expensive new equipment unless they thought they'd be able to use it at a profit. And in this case, the number of those Class 8 trucks that were ordered jumped 47% month over month and 160% year over year compared to last February. That's the highest order total since September 2022. Of course, FTR noted carefully the market still holds plenty of risk factors, as we were talking about at the top of the show. They listed the durability of a freight recovery. That's how long it might last, or how delicate it might be and subject to being overturned. Still high financing costs, potential for tariffs or regulatory shifts, and of course, geopolitical risks, such as the new war in the Middle East.
Well, Ben, that all makes sense. And as you mentioned earlier, with all that's going on, there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets right now.
There sure is. But despite it all, I got to say, FTR sounded pretty optimistic about trucking sector particularly. The report said that underlying demand is firming up more decisively, in their words, as 2026 progresses. And together with strengthening freight conditions, the market is not only stabilizing, but transitioning into the early stages of a cyclical recovery. In the words of Dan Moyer, he's a senior analyst with FTR, he said order patterns increasingly suggest a structured replacement cycle and forward-looking fleet planning rather than short-term catch-up buying. So only time will tell, but at least judging by February's numbers, we're on the right track.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way, and it looks hopeful and will be of good encouragement to the folks in trucking who have waited a very long time to finally see a turnaround.
A lot of folks have been waiting for this moment for some time. We hope it lasts.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank Jackson Wood of Descartes for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. And a reminder, Logistics Matters is sponsored by Storage Solutions. As the official North American arm of Jungheinrich, Storage Solutions brings more than 70 years of material handling and automation experience to operations across U.S. and Canada. As you plan for 2026, they can help you explore smarter automation, improve productivity, and build a strategy for long-term success. Learn more at storage-solutions.com. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.